it's as if you were making a journey all your life toward a certain destination that was understood or perceived in a certain way. And when you got there, it turned out to be totally different. And it comes as something of a shock to find out that while you were making that journey, the world has substantially changed. So the first reaction is really one of dismay.
Welders in an auto plant find themselves replaced by robots and permanently laid off. Mothers whose kids have grown and gone want paid employment but find they have few saleable skills. Junior and even senior executives are squeezed out by corporate mergers and management downsizing. Secretaries, accountants, school teachers, engineers, people from all walks of life decide they want to do something else, something more in line with their aspirations. It's becoming less and less likely that any of us will stay in one job for life. This program looks at occupational careers from the standpoint of middle age. We'll come to know two individuals who have learned through experience that you are indeed what you do. We'll hear how they changed, how the workplace itself has changed, and what the changes mean for people at all points along the life course of work. Mary is 48 years old. Growing up in a small town in the Texas Panhandle, she was raised with only one career in mind.
First of all, as a teenager, I wanted to be a wife and mother. That was the thing to do. And most of my friends were already married before they got out of high school. So I was really a late bloomer to wait until I graduated to marry.
At the age of
18. Many of my friends married at 14, 15, and 16. They had children by the time I married.
Mary's wedding was 3 weeks after her high school graduation.
And I started to college that fall and went one whole semester and half of the second semester and became pregnant and was threatening to miscarry. So I had to drop out of school and go to bed with my first baby.
Mary had been taught to be a dutiful wife and mother. Over the next 25 years, she raised 3 children. Being mom was a full-time job, a job Mary found difficult but rewarding.
There are some little glimpses through life that you remember as being particularly bright. And I can remember standing out in the backyard, and I had just taken diapers in off of the clothesline out of the sunshine and put them in the basket and had the basket under my arm, getting ready to go back in the house. And I just remember feeling very, very happy. I still remember that feeling that I had on walking in the house. I thought, man, life is really great, you know.
Throughout those 25 years, Mary kept alive a dream of returning to school, of doing something for herself. That's a long time to hang on to something.
It is, but it kept me going through many tough times.
When her youngest child started high school, Mary decided that now it was her time. She was 44 years old.
I remember my youngest daughter saying, well, Mom, will you still have time to help me with my homework when you go back to school, or will you be too busy? And I said, oh, I'll have time to help you with your homework. I said, nothing really is going to change except I'm just going to be in school too. Well, of course, lots of things did change.
For Mary, college was everything it was cracked up to be, and more. But in her second year as a full-time returning student, family conflicts came to a head, and Mary made a pronouncement.
The pronouncement was that everyone else, meaning, of course, mostly my husband, had to adjust to this, to the fact that I was going to school and that I was going to do something that I wanted to with my life, too, or we would part ways. And I was prepared to back that up because what I wanted to do was very important to me.
Her family learned how to operate the washing machine, the dryer, and the vacuum. They learned how to cook and wash dishes.
And I learned that many of the things I had always done over the years, I obviously had been doing for myself because no one else seemed to care if the house was messy. If they did, they would have picked it up.
Mary majored in psychology, minored in anthropology, and graduated in the top 0.5% of her class. Building upon her experiences, she took a new perspective on life.
for instance, learning about the rites of passage and puberty and weddings and things like that. So at my daughter's wedding last week, as I helped her get dressed, the anthropologist in me was thinking, yes, we're adorning the bride, just as some cultures tattoo their bride or plait the bride's hair. This culture, I am helping the bride put on her dress and her veil. And so I was thinking as an anthropologist, even in the midst of my daughter's wedding.
She also found something new in herself, something to share with her younger daughter.
I'm much prouder of the role model that I have presented to my youngest daughter than the role model I presented to my oldest daughter, who grew up 11 years earlier. Because I was a different person as the mother of my youngest.
Alice Rossi is a professor of sociology who has done extensive research on the work and family lives of women. She offers an historical perspective on women who return to school and then to work.
You see, the emergence of programs of continuing education got their start in the 1960s. The students who went in droves to those programs were really, as they said at Michigan, rusty ladies. They were women in their 40s. But with each passing decade, the returning woman is a younger woman because she's been withdrawn from employment for a shorter period of time.
It wasn't that long ago, statistically speaking, that a married woman's place was in the home.
Up until World War II, the profile of female employment was restricted for the most part to young, unmarried women. And with marriage or the birth of the child, but no later, most women withdrew from the labor force.
But after the war, in the early 50s, all that began to change. A shortage of unmarried women created a problem for employers. The social clock had to be reset.
There are some very hard economic and demographic reasons why married women were employed. The logical group for employers to hire in the 1950s, young unmarried women, there were something like 4 million fewer unmarried women in the early 1950s than there had been just 5 years before. Therefore, since jobs tend to be gender stratified, employers who wanted to hire nurses, teachers, clerks, saleswomen, social workers, waitresses, etc. down the line had no alternative if they wanted to fill the job slots but to turn to married women. So it was a change in the female labor force supply that began to make it possible for more married women to go to work.
Today, as more women take their place in the occupational system, more than half of the women with preschool children are employed. But at what age is it too late for a woman to return to school and then to work? Isn't Mary, at 48, too old?
No, if she wanted to be a Nobel laureate in science, I would say it's too late. But if you want to be a teacher, a department store buyer, a computer specialist, a whole wide variety of things that are not dependent on physical endurance. And that is increasingly most work in contemporary societies. Then being in your 40s is not too late to begin such a career any more than 40s is not too late to make mid-career corrections.
In spite of her academic honors, Mary has encountered some difficulties with the admissions committees of several graduate schools.
I think that they are looking for a return, and they realized that by the time I got out of grad school, I would be 53 years old, probably, if I went through a 5-year program, and that wouldn't be very long for me to do my thing and give any kind of reflection to the school from which I came. I can see their point, and yet I don't agree with it.
I think employers have to learn a bit more about how much more output they get from someone in their 50s who's newly come to a field compared to what the productivity is of someone who's been in that field in that same kind of job for years and years and years. I know this very intimately because I was a research social scientist until I was 47 and not doing any teaching. And so when I first hit the classroom in college, my colleagues had been teaching for 20 years, and they'd had it up to here with teaching, whereas I was just bubbling with the kind of as much adolescent enthusiasms as my students had.
But realistically, does someone in their late 40s or early 50s stand a good chance of breaking into a field and making a substantial contribution?
I think that if you look at the whole of careers, someone who comes in their 40s to a field, fresh and with new perspectives and not having to unlearn a lot, could make contributions the equal in the following 10 years to what some of their colleagues who'd been at the game for 40 years have made.
Sometimes the view at the top of the ladder isn't what you expected when you started the climb. Dan is a 56-year-old dentist.
I think when you're younger, you have a lot more energy and enthusiasm. And when you're at the game for 30 years, you tarnish some of that enthusiasm. A good example is you lose kitty tolerance, as most normal people do. So where at one time I could spend many hours, coaxing a child into a dental procedure that he didn't want to do, I don't have that patience anymore, and I realize that.
By almost any yardstick, Dan is successful. He's unusual in that he's invested 30 years in a single line of work. But in the course of those years, his profession has changed dramatically. The reason?
Prevention. Well, I've seen it through maybe 4 generations of the great-grandparents with dentures to the grandparents that had partials and had lost a few teeth to their children who had extensive dental work. This is of my vintage, but lost very few teeth. And now their children have next to no decay. They don't have the decay problem.
When the basic structure of our job changes, what do? In part, that depends upon how old we are. In part, it depends upon who we are and what we were looking for in the first place. Dan was 24, a newly graduated pharmacist, when Uncle Sam drafted him into dentistry during the Korean War.
I saw what I thought I'd like to do and was doing a little of it in the Army. And I didn't want to be a pharmacist, and I had to be something else. So, which way to go? Life kind of sometimes pushes you around, and you got to kind of swim with the current and do the most logical thing at the moment.
After the war, Dan married and fathered a child while he was working his way through dental school.
Kids say, "How did you do it then?" And I do not know. Working and going to school was a way of life back then for all the veterans.
After graduating from dental school at the age of 28, Dan found a mentor. He began to practice as the junior partner of an established dentist.
I was in practice with a genius, an older dentist who was magnificent. There are certain procedures and easy ways and shortcuts and just more graceful ways to do things that it helps if the older dentist can steer you.
In his 30s, Dan settled into his career and began to climb the ladder. At 38, he opened his own practice in his own office, becoming, like many others, his own man. Then came the 40s, and Dan began to grapple with the limitations of his life work.
We can never do anything perfect. It's a frustrating profession, regardless of how you want to satisfy somebody. You're dealing with pain, and you have to give some people some discomfort. That's all there is to it.
In his younger days, Dan worked 50 or even 60 hours a week. Now, in his 50s, he finds it difficult to slow down.
I promise myself I'm going to take Fridays off, and I end up squeezing a few patients in Friday mornings, and then somebody else calls, and before you know it, half a day's shot. I guess we build up a bank of old, beautiful patients, and you just can't say no.
Today, Dan is at best comfortable. He has little to no debt, but if he stops working, everything stops.
Retirement, that's another thing we got to look for. We go on in life. This is a very great concern to a lot of dentists my age. Retirement. Where'd all that money go?
Although a mentor played a major role in his work life, Dan doesn't wish to be one. In fact, he would recommend dentistry as a career to no one.
I haven't encouraged any of my young friends and patients and acquaintances to get into dentistry for a long time.
What made you stop recommending it?
Dentistry is not really a glamorous, fun thing to do. It's always been a health hazard, from hearing, muscular, neurological twisting and torquing of the body to bend over a patient, eyes, saliva splattered, and then, of course, you've got hepatitis and AIDS, and then the mental stress.
Dan's choice to stick with it is becoming rare. In fact, the odds of staying in one occupation for life are getting slimmer all the time. One national survey found that 90% of men in their late 50s and 60s had changed occupations at least once in their lives. We're most likely to change in our teens and 20s, less likely with each subsequent decade up to 60. Stephen Lazarus works extensively with those threatened by corporate restructuring or downsizing.
A great many of them felt they had a social contract with their corporation, and simply stated it was that if they performed well, their employment would continue. If they gave to the corporation would give to them in the form of continued employment. Suddenly, they find that contract doesn't exist, so they are struck that one of the basic premises on which they built their lives turns out to be false.
And when one of the basic premises of our lives turns out to be false, our very identity is shaken. That's because work tells us who we are. When someone asks, "What do you do?" we tell them, "I'm a dentist. I'm a housewife. I'm a mechanic. I'm a student."
You answer in terms of what you do. That's a very necessary thing to be able to say. It takes, I think, a very unusual person to say comfortably, "I do nothing," or "I loaf." When work is removed, when one loses definition through loss of work or loss of job or loss of almost any kind, even in the case of your dentist or your physician, the loss of joy in doing what they do. So I don't think it's pure theory. I think there's a lot of evidence to support the conclusion that it is a terribly negative consequence when that identifying purpose is taken away.
Lazarus has studied and worked with men who have lost identifying purpose.
It's as if you were making a journey all your life toward a certain destination that was understood or perceived in a certain way, and when you got there, it turned out to be totally different. And while the adventure of getting there might have been fun and reasonably satisfying, it comes as something of a shock to find out that while you were making that journey, the world has substantially changed. So the first reaction is really one of dismay.
Lazarus has found that the shock freezes some and frees up others. Those who do change find that aspects of their very selves change, as Mary did.
Well, I tend to look back on the person that I was almost as an outsider and see her as a pleasant person for the most part, but I see her as a pretty shallow, one-dimensional person too. There were some things about her that I liked, but there's more about me that I like now.
But if it's too late to change your career, you can at least adjust your expectations. Consider, In surveys, older people have said time and again that they are happier with their work than have younger people. Perhaps, like Mary, they've made a move to fit their job to their dream. Perhaps, like Dan, they've stayed put and made the best of things. Did you ever think of getting out of it?
No, there's nothing in the world I'd rather do.
Can you explain that and tell me?
No, I just, I like doing dentistry. I enjoy it. We have a happy time in the office. We are not severe. We do not treat dentistry as a life or death situation. We try not to make a big deal out of something that isn't a big deal.
How do you prepare an individual for a world that is going to change incessantly while he or she is growing and aging? There's a necessity for each individual to be the captain of his own fate and the pilot of his own soul. And even though that's a cliche and an extract from a 19th century poem, I think now more than ever it's a great truth, and the educational system has a great responsibility to understand this message and teach it.
That message may mean something very different to the young and the old. Professors Rossi and Lazarus offer counsel to working adults of all ages. First, for those of us beginning our careers.
If they're on the verge of just making their occupational choice at 20, which most of 20-year-olds I encounter are, I would say take a good, hard look at people who are actually in that occupation. Finding out what the jobs are really like, number one. But number two, what are they going to be like?
I would also suggest that a linear existence is no longer appropriate for what that young person is confronting. And by linear experience, I mean you educate yourself until you're in your early 20s, you work until you're 65, and then you do something called leisure. But rather, you design your life to have parallel experiences. You break away from work periodically and go back and refresh yourself in graduate school, or maybe equipping yourself with new skills. I think that is a good general idea for that person starting out. Don't think life is lived anymore in these three nicely set segments.
For those of us who are midway in the life course of work, they offer cautions.
The 40-year-old is an interesting person these days because he is the outrider of the baby boom. And I think for one thing, it's going to get extraordinarily rougher than he or she has seen it in the past decade. Less opportunity, shrinking promotional opportunity, a lot of pressure from the people behind, not necessarily a great willingness of the people up ahead to vacate their position. I think that 40-year-old is in for a very rude awakening, and then a period of years in which things will become progressively tougher.
The case of Mary gives a good little example of one point I would make, and that is a kind of forewarning that people can't turn themselves inside out and make really a 180-degree change. That if she's on an escalating curve of psychological growth, it is not necessarily matched in a parallel way by the same ability and interest and motivation to change on the part of family members. Because it is much easier for her to gain a new freedom and a new area of expression than it is for a man at midlife to retread himself psychologically and emotionally to be a, quote, fully adequate partner.
And for those of us approaching the 60s and the prospect of retirement, a more personal view.
I can't think of anything that would be worse, and I've seen a few friends who've done this, working mightily right up to the moment of retirement, and then never having engaged in any active sports, never having any serious commitments to leisure time or to politics, buying a condominium in Florida. And that Florida condominium becomes a dull, deadening trap.
I would say you're going to be healthy for quite some time, and you may find that you're going to be very, very bored and find your existence rather arid and unfulfilling the day you drop your traditional work role completely. You ought to start thinking about part-time work, but more than anything else, make darn sure that you are going to have a way of maintaining identifiable and satisfying purpose in your life as you go through these very good years post-60.
No matter what our position along the life course of work, whether we're just entering, well on the way, or about to leave, there are changes ahead. The rules of the game will shift, and so will the roles of men and women and the settings of the social clock. We may be forced to work or forced out of work. We may resurrect a dream or put one to rest. However change comes, it's unlikely that we'll spend an entire life walking the same path. It's even more unlikely that what energized us at the beginning will sustain us at the end. Perhaps in our work, as in our lives, we have to think in terms of seasons. Not one career for one life, but several careers, each coming in its own time, each with its own identifying purpose.
Getting that degree was something I really wanted, but I never expected it to be as much fun as it turned out to be. I learned things that I never knew existed, and it opened up whole new worlds to me.